So if you just read it and then talk me through your thoughts as an examiner or a teacher.
All right. So The Great Gatsby in this passage were written in the early 20th century, set in America during the Prohibition period, which influences the way pleasure-seeking in both texts is linked to the illicit consumption of alcohol at wild parties. Now, that opening sentence is perfect in that it's talking about both texts, because sometimes the tendency is, if you've studied The Great Gatsby, to just talk about The Great Gatsby. And in this response, they're looking for that connections and comparisons. Right. And so that is being very explicit, both texts, making a reference to context in that opening sentence, and getting straight into the task, which was rewards and disappointment. So that idea of linking context to the actual task, prohibition, drinking, that instead of just kind of name-dropping context, this novel is known as the Great Jazz Age novel. That doesn't add anything. Right. So something about context, which is linked to rewards and partying, is a much better way of approaching context. Both texts feature characters who restlessly seek pleasure and excitement as a distraction. Once again, going back to the task, linking The Great Gatsby alongside this unseen passage. From what they perceive to be banality of the everyday. However, the writer suggests that the rewards of pleasure-seeking are fleeting and transient, and a life lived in this way leads to loneliness and despair. Now, the vocabulary of this student is really good. The level of sophistication is what you would want in a top mark essay. In the end, both writers are critical of the result of the restless pursuit of pleasure and suggest it ultimately leads to disappointment. Now, what's also really good about this is that they have already answered the question.
Yes.
And it's making it clear, okay, yes, restless pursuit of pleasure, so I've got the pleasure seeking, how it leads to disappointment.
Yeah.
And the rest of this essay should be my evidence to prove my argument.
Yeah, so this is kind of the essay plan, isn't it?
Yeah,
that first paragraph.
Exactly. And what the examiner gets is they know the direction of the essay. There's no question of, well, what's this essay going to be about? They've talked about one particular character, but how is this going to link back to the text and the tasks? So,
okay, that's really clear.
And then it goes straight into the pursuit of pleasure is presented through differing narrative perspectives. So once again, the task, and then a very specific technique. And that's also what you're being marked for in this essay, is AO2, using the terminology but then explaining. So narrative perspectives. Fitzgerald uses Nick as a narrator both inside and outside the hedonistic world of wealth. It's a lovely phrase, isn't it? Hedonistic world of wealth. As a kind of moral commentator on the action. The opening pages of the novel, that's a really nice technique, because that's how you get into structure.
Okay,
and talking about how the novel is put together. Sometimes students want to talk about structure in terms of punctuation or how an individual phrase, and that's brilliant, but it's kind of those big comments about the whole novel. Why, this novel's told in a non-chronological way, but Nick controls all the information, and so he is the biggest technique that Fitzgerald uses.
And presumably that will fit any question, because you have to bring structure in.
You have to bring structure in.
And so Nick's always going to carry that importance. Okay, that's really helpful.
Nick is someone who is confided in by others. I was privy to the secret griefs of the wild unknown men, but also as someone of ordinary, respectable...
Sorry.
That's all right. Also someone of ordinary, respectable stock, aware of fundamental decencies. Although he argues he has been taught to reserve all judgments, using this phrase implies that judgments can be made, and as such, we are led by Fitzgerald to see Nick as a moral voice in a world that restlessly pursues fleeting pleasure. Once again, the whole paragraph was about pleasure, but what they've done really well are those embedded quotations.
Yes.
You don't get to take the text in. Nick is the storyteller, so anything he says is relevant. And so, memorizing a few of those quotations, it's not going to be at a loss to focus on things that Nick says, because you're going to be able to use those for anything.
Oh, right, so memorize the Nick quotations that fit any essay.
Yeah, they do fit any essay, because he's got comments on all the characters. It's his story. It's his reflection piece, isn't it?
Does he carry the authorial voice as well, or not?
Definitely.
Okay.
So
he's going to pay double.
Yeah,
because you can
exactly.
talk about the author's viewpoint at the same time.
Exactly, and this idea of Nick being a moral voice, I mean,
Yeah.
that goes back into that of the 20s being known as the lost generation.
Yes.
And Nick is recognizing that they're lost, but he's able to offer his own critical judgments in the very beginning, but in the end, he does see the beauty in Gatsby and characters like him.
Let's carry on.
This moral position will be questioned at several points in the novel. Once again, structure.
Yes.
And carrying that through. As we see Nick drawn into an increasingly corrupt world, he colludes with Daisy and Gatsby in an adulterous liaison. He is also drawn into Tom's affair with Myrtle. When one afternoon he is taken by Tom to see his girl, Nick suggests that he was unwilling. He literally forced me off the car. This student has a really good understanding of the novel. Really.
Yes.
Even this girl, the little phrases, how they're just embedded. That's a much better technique than when he says.
Yes. Which is clumsy and clunky.
It's very clunky. And although that's good, that's where a more perceptive, sophisticated student is going to get more points in that it flows together.
And that's interesting. I often talk to my pupils about that because you end up saying the same thing, but because you're much more fluent in this style, the examiner just wants to reward you because you seem a better student.
Yeah, you do.
So it's really worth practicing that fluency, not just learning the novel.
Exactly.
Okay.
Some readers have seen Nick's position to be akin to the writer or reader. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. However, some critics have seen a moral ambiguity. Now, they're getting into critical commentary here.
Yeah.
You don't need this for this Gatsby essay. Right. It's fine to do. You're not going to lose points, but your critic is for the history boys in this particular exam. That's where you're going to get credit for that. It's not losing anything, but some critics' moral ambiguity. I think you could have gone back and given another language example, talked about another symbol in the book, maybe brought in some of the parties, whereas you could have had a few more points for AO2, which is where you're going to get points for this exam.
Okay. So although this is the mark of an excellent student, they're not thinking tactically about the exam and how they're going to be rewarded.
No. So you wouldn't lose, but once again, you could have gone back.
Yeah, there's another point you could have made that would have scored more marks, isn't there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they have talked about narrative voice. Some readers find his morality weak or even hypocritical. He is shocked by Tom's behavior, the way he's lied to Myrtle. Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was shocked at first by the elaborateness of the lie. Only a little shocked. Yeah, I think you could have done more. This particular student could have done more with language or symbolism in that one. However, we view him, moral or otherwise, as an observer. He becomes complicit in this corrupt world. He gets drunk with others. Now, what they're doing is they're really focusing on the novel. And I think that's where a lot of students have that tendency to look at the small extract they're given and spend way too long on an extract they have only just met.
Yes.
Instead of the novel they have spent a whole year with. And I think that's what this essay so far is doing really well. If I just go back, that opening made those links, and then the rest of this essay so far has been about the Great Gatsby.
So it seems to me the opposite of GCSE. At GCSE, you'll focus mostly on the passage and the extract. Here at AS, the extract's just a springboard to talk about the novel. It's
just a springboard, and we're going to see in the next paragraph, it does kind of go back, but you're thinking 70% on the Great Gatsby, 30%
on the extract. Okay, that's really helpful.
However we view him, moral or otherwise, as an observer, he becomes complicit in this corrupt world. He gets drunk with all the others, something he tries to suggest out of character. I've been drunk just twice in my life. The second time was that afternoon. This episode ends in drunken violence with Myrtle's nose bleeding, possibly broken. If this is Tom's pursuit of pleasure, once again bringing in the words of the task.
The title, really
good. The way this episode is portrayed gives a strong sense of disappointment. So once again, making an argument about that initial task, the rewards and disappointments of pleasure seeking. Earlier in the novel, Nick had described him as one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. He felt Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. lovely use of quotation there. When, at the end of the novel, he shakes Tom's hand, it seems silly not to. Readers are divided in their response to him. Some feel this is hypocritical, knowing Tom's life has been built on a lie. He says nothing. There was nothing I could say except the unutterable fact that it wasn't true. Others feel Nick response. You're getting into kind of critical reading here, and I don't think...
He doesn't need it.
You don't need that.
Or she doesn't need it.
No.
So... I used to train at GCSE my students to look at alternative interpretations as a way into the author's viewpoint. Here you're saying that's superfluous for this task.
Yeah, it's good to do, but once again, think about where your points are being weighed. This isn't your AO5 critical reading.
Yes.
It's helpful, it's good, it pads it out, but could you have focused a little bit more on, character devices here, or... the language and the description or tone, another opportunity to give a term, anything like that.
Okay.
In contrast, the narrative voice of the passage is someone more obviously caught up in the restless pursuit of pleasure. Really nice contrast between the character of Nick and that unseen passage.
Yeah.
The New York lady is in a sense an outsider like Nick, but unlike him, she is driven by a more overt desire to be part of the social scene. More overt desire. That's a very sophisticated way of saying that, isn't it? The narrative has a restless quality with the elliptical style. See much better use of terminology. Yes. Characteristic of a diary. Here we're talking about form, what type of writing this is. Couldn't have been more furious. Started to fight, but too dead. The use of italics for emphasis gives the sense of spoken style, as does the use of intensifiers like absolutely, too, and really. I lost my train. The constant referencing to fashionable places and people suggest a character who is trying to impress. See, this one's talking more about language.
Yeah.
And could we have done that a little bit more?
Yes. Yeah, it would match better, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And then we go back to Gatsby. In contrast, Nick's narrative is more reflective and poetic in style. Much better discussion of language here. In suggesting a more thoughtful reaction to society. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. I love that sentence.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Once again, you've got a critic. Critics have noted Keats-like quality. Okay, brilliant. Why don't you focus on the poetic quality?
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is all these notes about the critics are highlighted here, and you've got some sort of examiner comment.
Well, AO5 is not assessed in this question. It's useful for AO1, understanding of the novel, and it does show wider reading and all of that. But this is where, in A2, this is where this is going to count.
Yes.
In the history boys on this same paper, this is where this counts. So it just seems, it's not a wasted sentence, but I think it's enough to show the examiner, has this student got the right focus?
Yeah.
Have they been taught the right thing for this paper? And I think some examiners would question which exam are you sitting here? Is this the A2 or is this the AS? The description in the passage of the party has similarities to Fitzgerald's description of Gatsby's parties. Both writers suggest entertainment is a key part of their effect. The New York lady describes the way they had those Hungarians in green coats, and Stewie Hunter was leading them with a fork. Nick describes the orchestra as no thin five-piece affair, but a whole pit of oboes and trombones and saxophones and viols and cornets and piccolos and low and high drums. It goes on and on. Love that. Fitzgerald's style is lush and rich. Really good discussion here of language. Syndetic listing, which is a real contrast to the abrupt and frenetic style of the diary. A good mention of contrast there to the unseen passage.
And what does syndetic listing mean?
How it's been ordered.
Okay.
And that I would actually call that polysyndeton.
Right.
Because it's making you pause and think. The list sounds really long and it's intensive, and he's emphasizing every word there.
Okay.
And so it's sort of pounding it in, how many things are there, like you're looking, and this, and this, and this, and this.
Whereas if it just been commas, it would just be a list, you wouldn't focus on anything in particular.
Yeah.
Okay.
However, the next where was I? Glamour of such occasion, there is always a constant undermining of the glamour. Spice-baked hams crowded against salads of harlequin designs. The word crowded suggests too much ostentation. So even focusing on a word is just as valuable as using a term like I would not have used synthetic. Like I said, I would have chose something else. It means, but that's still your credit for AO2.
Lovely.
Phrases like, once again, the bar is in full swing, introductions are forgotten on the spot, and the earth lurches away from the sun, suggest a wild, drunken mood. Nick notes people were not invited. Once again, this student is bringing in the quotation as a part of the sentence. Nick notes
these are quotations that the students memorize.
They've memorized them.
Wow.
No book. Yeah. There's a strong sense of criticism in the way no one really knows anyone. See, that is students. That's the student being critical. That's where you don't need. That's a much better use on this paper than having critics have noted.
Yeah.
However, unlike the lady in New York, Nick sees himself as different to the hangers-on who would come to take advantage of Gatsby's hospitality. I had actually been invited. Fitzgerald suggests that Gatsby himself has no need of all this revelry. He never drinks. He is never seen with a woman. He's only hoping his reward will be Daisy. Some critics see this as ennobling him and setting him apart from the others. As Nick says, you're worth the whole damn bunch put together. However, others have seen in the collapse of his dream an ironic comment on the empty nature of the capitalist American dream.
Okay.
That's a really good phrase to use. Yeah. That's your tick for context there.
Yes, and that will fit any essay as well, won't it?
Any essay, okay. That's right. After all, the charm in Daisy's siren-like voice comes down to money. If Fitzgerald criticizes this society through Nick's voice, describing the way Tom and Daisy destroy Gatsby's innocence, take his and Myrtle's lives, and retreat back to their money, Parker also criticizes it through irony. In much the same way, the dramatic monologues work in poetry, allowing the speaker to reveal their darker side, as if unconsciously, this New York lady, in spite of her efforts to create the impression that she has a rich and fulfilling life, gives way to her loneliness and even despair, and her manic efforts to sound busy. Her domestic life is empty. And now here we're getting into more of the extracts.
Ooh. Shall we wrap it up there and just look at the conclusion?
In this passage, there's a sense of the way the pursuit of pleasure takes a physical toll on the body. Just as the New York lady ends up alone after the party, ultimately Gatsby is alone. So once again, going back to our key text.
Yeah, and the case that they made in the first paragraph.
Yep. So I think it's a very well-structured essay. I think the balance was right with talking about Gatsby. I mean, you've only had this paragraph, a little bit there. So once again, that 30%, you dip into that extract. You don't spend a lot of time on the extract.
And so what's the examiner given this?
Canada has shown a clear understanding. So you're looking in about a band 2, so not a top band.
Wow.
There are, so good and clear understanding of American context. Could they have used a little bit more context to get into perceptive? Yes. We only saw the introduction in that one sentence about context. So I think perhaps some of those critical comments discussing a critic may have been a better opportunity to bring in context. So that would have been a perceptive.
So this is really useful for me because reading the essay, this sounds like the very top candidate.
Yeah.
But what you're pointing out is the exam skills that they're missing, not the English literature skills, but just not hitting the right assessment criteria.
So the OCR is very good about doing positive marking. So if there are elements of band 1, they will get credit for that, but this would definitely be at the top of a band 2, bottom of a band 1.
Okay. What else have you spotted?
Let's see. They did make a reference to AO5 is not a requirement for this essay. It's been used effectively to inform discussion. They did appreciate the use of terminology. The argument is very well structured.
Yeah.
And that is a top band requirement.
So am I getting from this then that the main thing they'd have to put in is context that's relevant?
A little bit more context and not straying off into the critics.
Was there a case for more focus on the language?
Possibly a little bit more on Gatsby. I think on a couple of the paragraphs where they went in to use a critic is where they could have gone back in and discussed language instead.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.